Good Wednesday, and welcome to another edition of Mount Calvary Daily Devotions. I am Vicar Matt. Please join me in prayer. Blessed Lord, you have caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning. Please grant that we may so hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that by the patience and comfort of your holy word, we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life through Jesus Christ. Amen. So today I'd like to run through 1 Chronicles chapters 9 through 17. So we'll finish off again kind of where we ended off yesterday at the end of chapter 9, going through the end of chapter 17. And I think it's really very helpful to start with the image that shows up, the answer of God to David that shows up in chapter 17. This is maybe a familiar story that you might recognize when David is blessed with the kingship and newfound unity and strength of the nation of Israel, and wants to build God a house. And Nathan gets the answer from Nathan that instead of David building a house, God's going to build a house instead. God is going to be the one who builds the house, and it will last forever. And so this brings up an interesting point that is pretty well addressed by what shows up in these chapters of 1 Chronicles. Our natural inclination to build the house ourselves, to want to build the house on our own terms, for us to be the ones to build the house, a shelter in this life from suffering and pain and the turmoil and most especially the things that we recognize we don't have any control over in this life. We wish to have control. Sometimes the temptation is just to hide, just to build a house for you, a hiding place, a shelter, and just hide from everything. But instead, as we see in these chapters, it is God's intent to build us a house that lasts forever. Even as Jesus says in the Gospel according to St. John and other places, that he goes before us, he goes back to the Father, to heaven, to build a house, to prepare a room, a mansion for us, that we might dwell with him forever. And so we see this show up in other ways through these chapters, and I'll point it out again as we get to that. But it's interesting to note the progression here through 1 Chronicles starts in the ending of you could say, the genealogy section. So there's still quite a few lists of people, but the purpose changes in these chapters. We finish off with family genealogies, a genealogy that pretty obviously shows the ancestors, direct ancestors of Jesus Christ, the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, leading all the way from Adam, all the way to Joseph and Mary in Nazareth, in Bethlehem. And so this genealogy changes in an interesting way. We hear about the returned exiles, who are the people who exist well after David and Solomon and all of the other kings, when the Israelites are brought back from the exile that was caused by a breach of faith, which is something that shows up here after in the death of Saul. So we hear a return to Saul's genealogy, or turning back in time again, quite a few hundred years. And we hear about, after Saul's genealogy, his death, and that is followed by the purpose statement, a breach of faith. So Saul is killed, and pretty obviously as a direct result of God's will, because of his breach of faith. So we see a return of this, and we will many times over, this breach of faith, or contrasted by faithfulness. So breach of faith on the part of Saul and others who die, who are killed, who are allowed to die, and others contrasted with David and the nation of Israel as a whole at this time of David, with great growth and life and a promise of an everlasting house, a promise of an everlasting kingship and presence, and even perhaps also worship and God's presence to save and to build. So that's chapters 9 and 10. We move on to chapter 11. This is when David gets anointed and the kingdom is unified. We see a lot of narrative. We shift from the genealogies to narrative in the death of Saul and his breach of faith, and building to more of a climax, not quite to the climax I think yet, with David being anointed and recognized by the kingdom, the peoples being gathered. And I did want to read those a few passages here. So chapter 10, verse 13 identifies that breach of faith for Saul. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. So here it's explicit. This turning over the kingdom is because God wills it and God makes it happen. God is the one building the house. And moving on to chapter 11, verse 9, becomes very interesting when you recognize the words here. Chapter 11, verse 9, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him. Another way to interpret that Hebrew word hosts is armies. The God of armies was with him. And we hear about David's mighty men, the armies that God gathered to David, even relatives of Saul, ready to fight against him, or even just at least to support David. So the mighty men joined David and support him. And in that chapter 12, we hear about that in that chapter 12, verse 22, for from day to day men came to David to help him, until there was a great army, like an army of God. So here in this part of 1 Chronicles, instead of David being praised as the one who did it all by himself, we hear about what God is doing, especially the God of hosts, the God of armies. Gathering armies, gathering the nation, the peoples of Israel, the tribes of Israel, to support David and to make the kingdom of Israel grow under a faithful king as opposed to the wicked king Saul. And what's interesting to note about what follows in the last few chapters for today, chapters 13 through 16, we see a little bit of back and forth. Following this celebration, the coronation of David, David makes his first attempt at moving the ark. And he quite obviously did not follow the instructions, and a man by the name of Uzzah died trying to move the ark in their own way, as opposed to carrying it on the poles, and no less by Levites. So David is scared and didn't really understand, obviously, what was happening there, and is afraid. We get a little back and forth with the Philistines. The Philistines attack, and David demonstrates faithfulness, seeking God's answer in his direction. Should he go to fight or should he not? And so twice, God answers David. Second time, God gives David a little bit of a surprise answer. Don't attack them at the front to meet them face to face, but around through some trees, balsam trees, based on a signal. And you hear the sound of an army marching in the tops of the trees, then go. And so David is encouraged and makes a second attempt at moving the ark, this time according to Mosaic law, using the Levites, which identifies here in this broader scheme for us, for the hearers and readers of 1 Chronicles, the need for the Levites. Again, a return to this idea, the necessity of worship and God speaking to his people. In 16, we hear about this renewal of Levitical worship and a couple of direct psalm quotes, Psalm 105 and 96. And finally, with chapter 17, God's answer to David wanting to build him a house, that he will build David a house Instead, that God will be the one who builds the house, even as he's demonstrated already through gathering the nation, the armies, to support and make this kingdom grow. Let's close with prayer. Blessed Lord, you have caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning. Please grant that we may so hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, but that by the patience and comfort of your holy word, we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, through Jesus Christ. Amen.